Welcome to Voices,
a podcast from the Institute for Human Rights and Business.
Here, we're seeking to elevate the range of perspectives
on the role of business in the world
and in people's everyday lives.
Hello, everybody. This is Francesca Fairbairn from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, and I'm talking today to Mark Dickinson, who's General Secretary of the Maritime Trade Union, Nautilus International. We're talking to Mark today about the updates to the Maritime Labour Convention. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Francesca. Good to be here.
Mark started his maritime career at 16. He joined the British Merchant Navy and has been a unionist on behalf of seafarers, both ITF and at Nautilus for several decades. In fact, you've been General Secretary at Nautilus for 13 years, I think. Is that right?
First elected in 2009, that's right, when the new union was created through the merger between the British Union, Dutch Union, and then later the Swiss Union, yeah.
And before that, you were, I believe, instrumental in the development of the Maritime Labour Convention from the very outset. IHRB is interested in issues seafarers. We've been working on seafarers' rights since 2018. We contributed to the UN Global Compact's crew change guidance for companies, and I think we'll probably come back to that topic in a bit. And more recently, we developed with the Sustainable Shipping Initiative a seafarers' rights code of conduct, which is one measure towards improving corporate practice and accountability. And that code of conduct is based on and goes beyond the current MLC. The MLC itself, just brief background, is an international treaty to protect seafarers' rights, brought into force in 2006. It's been ratified by, I believe, more than 100 countries now. Yeah,
just past the 100 mark. Last month. I think it's already on to 102, I think.
Fantastic. And it represents over 90% of the world's fleet.
Yeah.
One of its provisions, I believe, is that the Special Tripartite Committee, which is government, ship owners and seafarers representatives,
that's right,
meet periodically to review and update the convention. And the last meeting was in May 2022, so just passed, where a number of changes were agreed. Now, Mark, I believe you played a pivotal role in negotiating these changes. So I wonder if you could just firstly summarize the changes that you managed to push through.
Okay. So that's right. The STC, the fourth session of the Special Tripartite Committee took place in May. It'd been split into two parts. It had a previous session online only the previous year when we'd sort of reflected on the seafarers' experience during COVID-19 and obviously the crew change crisis that you've mentioned already. And then there's the session that we held hybrid means. We had people in the room and we had people joining us online. It was the meeting to look at the 12 proposals that were put forward, 2 by governments and 10 jointly by the ship owners and the seafarers, and separately by the seafarers. So we did a lot of work running up to the meeting. Mm-hmm. With our social partner. We have a very active social partnership in the ILO, uniquely, I think, judging by what others say about other sectors and how they engage with the ILO and with the employers. So we have a very active social partnership, which predates COVID, because that partnership was really effective during COVID, because we basically fixed all the problems that the government had created by locking out the industry. And again, mentioning the due diligence in the supply chain that was really helpful, that came out to try and put pressure on cargo owners, charterers to find solutions to the crew change crisis. But that doesn't, that partnership is it's not a walk in the park. It doesn't mean the employees roll over every time the unions demand something. So we have to work at it, and it's still a tough set of negotiations. So we had 5 proposals that we put forward together. They covered issues like making sure that personal protective equipment was appropriate particularly for women. This has been an issue that's been raised on ships. We've had motions at my own unions meetings about women standing there with examples of PPE that they've been given, which is a sort of one size fits all, been supplied to the ship to fit a Scandinavian 8-foot 18-stone seafarer, and everybody's expected to just wear this stuff. So it sounds like a fairly minor issue, but actually in terms of implications and making the career accessible to women, it's really important. So that was the first one. Shipowners supported that. That went through fairly straightforward. Improving the food that's provided on board, and also clarifying that fresh water needs to be provided free of charge, because 2022 and seafarers are being charged for bottled water on ships, because ships' water isn't good enough, So again, we were able to improve the existing language around that and clarify that this should be provided free of charge. Repatriation, so that's when seafarers get sent home at the end of their contracts. That's the sort of normal circumstance. But when ships are abandoned by ship owners, when this happens all too frequently, and COVID again has created a new upswing in the numbers of cases of abandonment.
I believe it's third record year number of abandonments.
Yeah. So what we've been finding over the years, and this is our sort of practical experience, and this feeds into the MLC. The MLC can be updated, which is why the STC. That's what the STC is charged with doing, keeping the convention under review. Again, pretty unique in ILO circles for a convention to be amendable relatively easily, if I may describe it like that. So we were able to make some improvements around the obligations of port states in particular to resolve abandoned ships and the suffering of the seafarers quickly, and to make sure that any seafarers joining subsequently a vessel that has been abandoned, or where seafarers have been abandoned, that the port states make sure that the seafarers that are joining the vessel have access to their rights under the convention, so you don't create another crew that get abandoned and another crew, because port states often insist upon a minimum number of seafarers being retained on board an abandoned vessel for safety purposes, to maintain the vessel as it sits there anchored or in the port. And this can create a logjam in resolving crew changes quickly, getting seafarers home and back to their families, and paid, of course. So that was an important change to the convention. Medical care, access to medical care promptly. This was one of the issues that you'll be familiar with in the work that you did during the crew change crisis. Lots of seafarers denied access to medical care because of this kind of overriding public health concern that many countries sort of invoked to keep ships out, to keep crews from coming ashore and infecting the local population, or vice versa. So this created a lot of problems during the crew change crisis, and perhaps that's, of all the amendments I've mentioned so far, that's probably the first one you could say COVID. Yeah, this is directly because of COVID that we brought this forward. So again, we had joint support, and we got governments to support that, and also to repatriate. When the sad and unfortunate circumstance where a seafarer dies at sea, we had basically, I can't really soft soap this one, that we had bodies in freezers with ship supplies for months, being pushed from pillar to post. Pretty shocking, but that's the reality. For that had been the experience and the reality, and we were able to tighten the language around that to make sure that the flag state, or the port state, or the territory which the vessel first passes into, where they have a dead seafarer on board, or where they need to repatriate the body, that's done so quickly, and there's an obligation there. I mean, I think, if I may just sort of segue into saying this at this point, many of the amendments that we discussed and agreed during SDCW, strictly speaking, they shouldn't have been necessary, especially around the COVID experience. But unfortunately, the reality said we needed to tighten the language up and shine a light on what had happened, and demand and seek changes just to make it absolutely crystal clear that these rights and obligations were there and they needed to be respected. And a global pandemic is no excuse. So that's the context in which many of the things that we brought forward. There was a technical change we needed to make that the ship owners brought forward regarding the financial security provisions that are contained within the convention. If the ship owner needs to be identified on most, if not all, the MLC related documentation. Unfortunately, the way the industry is structured, there are other parties that play a significant role, and P&I clubs who provide the insurance, the financial security system. The predominant methodology is through P&I clubs. They often contract with the registered owner, who can be different from the actual owner or the beneficial owner as we often refer to it as. And this is causing problems in ports where port state control inspectors go on board, expect to see the ship owner's name on the certificate saying this is who's going to provide the security, and it's often not that entity, it's the registered owner, and then they detain the ship, or they give it a mark saying that it's deficient, and that causes issues down the line. So that's a technical change, which again, we were happy to support in return for the support for others. The next one I want to highlight is social connectivity, which I think is the one that probably piqued your interest initially in what we achieved in May. And that's getting a mandatory obligation for the ship owner to provide basically internet access for communication with home, with loved ones. And again, that would be a COVID. I mean, we have argued and demanded and squeezed the ship owners on internet access for as long as the Wi-Fi and internet has been around, which feels like a generation now. But the technology hasn't been there, or the costs have been high. And now I think, those arguments are falling away. The technology is changing at a pace. The costs are falling. The technological advances in the industry to support the ship's business means that, the ships have it. And it's a question of, can we have a little bit of that bandwidth so that the guys can WhatsApp the families at home? Again, COVID shone a light on that, because guys were doing 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 months, in some cases longer, in some examples. So that was an important one. That's probably that's the jewel, I think, in what we had achieved. And they didn't give it up easily. It left a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth as we argued and twisted and turned in the debate during STC about whether there were going to be any charges for that, or whether the technology really was that advanced as, and what are your guys going to do with it if we give it? Are they going to stream Netflix, movies? They're going to binge watch the latest must-watch series, season 1, 2, 3 on and actually it's more about communication. Frankly, I think they should be able to download and stream movies. I don't know why we have to be treated any differently than somebody who works ashore. And I also don't understand why employers, ship owners, don't understand that if they're going to recruit and retain the talent that they say they need for the industry, that this isn't, it's a human right these days, for internet access. And so,
yeah, I mean,
but we got something anyway. Sorry.
The comparison I draw is that I wouldn't want my boss, for example, telling me what I can watch on telly when I've clocked off, and it's very much the same.
Yeah, but that I think if I'm balanced about it, and I try to be, I'm trying to think, well, what have they got a point? Is there an argument for restricting access or limiting it and that? And I think, well, look, what someone watches is pretty much down to them. But if they've got any concerns about it, for example, if I go to work, I'll use the Wi-Fi in my office. If I try to Google eBay and pull up eBay, it won't let me. That'd be a blocked site because they don't want me shopping during office hours. And you're thinking, so if they think we're going to watch something illegal or whatever, then they can easily set up the systems for that. Yeah, isn't it? Mm-hmm. My guys are professionals. They know they need to be rested. They know they need to be fit for their job. There's an obligation in international conventions for them to be so. They've got lots of rights in these conventions. They've also got obligations, which they take very seriously. So I think, those concerns about they won't go to sleep, they'll spend all their time on the internet, or it won't be good for their mental health. And I'm thinking, well, it's not good for them not to have it for their mental health. So I think you can have it both ways.
Yeah.
But, sometimes if you've got greater connectivity with home, the story goes, well, so when I went to see Francesca, if I give you a real example, it was a few years back, I used to get letters from home about every, say, 6-8 weeks, maybe longer if we did a long crossing across the Pacific. So you'd get letters from home, and you'd have a pile, and you'd have the first one might say, "Oh, the dog died. Really sorry to let you know," and there's nothing you can do about it. Do you know what I mean? Or your girlfriend popped round and said to stop writing to her, she's not interested anymore. We used to say, you get a Dear John letter from your girlfriend. So those things were you couldn't do anything about it because it already happened. You were reading history. The next letter in the pile say, "Oh, don't worry, Granny's fine now. She had a minor wobble. I mentioned in my first letter, but she's fine now, and everything's good, and whatever." So these days with instant connectivity, WhatsApp, you can't do anything about it because you're in the middle of the Pacific or you're in the middle of the Atlantic, and people say that creates its own problem. But again, these days, that's not seen as a, having that connectivity is really, really important to young people. That certainly it's more important for them. It wouldn't be good for them to be isolated, and they won't go to sea. It's the first question they're going to ask. What's the Wi-Fi like?
Exactly.
Can connect. Can I still do me Facebook? I think Facebook page is a bit passé now, isn't it? I don't know whether it's Instagram, TikTok, or whatever it is these days. So you just got to move with the times, and this is really, really important. It sounds not, but it is really, really important, and I'm glad we were able to get that over in terms of there being a mandatory obligation to ensure social connectivity. And then in the guidance, because the convention is, this the core bits that the STC are concerned about, code A and code B. A is mandatory, B is guidance, but it's a bit more than that. It's not like optional. It's guidance, but it's not optional to follow it. That's what people misunderstand about code B. You've got to follow it, but how you follow it, you might find a different way to comply than the strict reference or guidance that's providing code B. So, but it says in the language that any charges for internet access, if any, shall be reasonable. And I think the beauty about the English language, at least, I don't know how it translates into Spanish and French, but the beauty of the English language is when you read that, the plain understanding of it is that charges are exceptional. Charges, if any, shall be reasonable. So I hope that good employers will, if they're not already doing it, let's be clear, there's an awful lot of good employers out there who provided, and they also provided more in terms of bandwidth and data limits during COVID. That was their response. And I think once you do that, I would hope that they didn't row backwards. Now that we're out, or we're crew change crisis isn't over, but it's certainly less of an issue than it was at its peak. So that's an important one. And of course, also the port authorities are being encouraged to provide Wi-Fi access in ports and anchorages as well. And I think if ship owners step up and provide coverage, and if they adopt best practice and they want to recruit the best, so that they want to be at the leading edge of this type of provision, then the port provision becomes less important because it's on the ship and that's where you're living and working for significant parts of your time. Sorry, Francesca, if I went on a bit long on that one, but a couple of areas now where we didn't agree. We didn't reach tripartite consensus, and the first one of that was we were trying to tighten up the liability that the ship owner has to protect the seafarers from any monetary loss, because often the ship owner is not the employer. I mean, that's just the nature of, I would say it's quite a precarious employment model in shipping for the majority of seafarers. They have say, let's pick 20% of the labor market is Filipino seafarers. They would have an employer based in Manila. They'd be recruited through an agency. They've signed a contract with that. It's regulated by the government agency, POEA, Philippines Overseas Employment Agency. And then they would fly overseas, they'd join a ship, and that's where they kind of meet the ship owner. Although again, that's not actually a physical experience. That's they're on the ship that belongs to someone, and it might become apparent who that is. And sometimes the agent doesn't fulfill their obligations, and the convention establishes that there's a joint and several liability for that. But that's the kind of theory. The practice is much more difficult for the seafarers to access, pursue a claim. So we've agreed a resolution. The STC can adopt resolutions, which basically says, let's go away and look at this in a bit more detail. Let's have another discussion. It sort of informs the future work program in maritime for the ILO. So that's an important sort of, we haven't lost that, but it wasn't agreed. So we move on with that. We also were unable, and this is, I think, probably one of the first times that one of the three groups represented in the STC, seafarers, ship owners, governments, outrightly rejected a proposal, and that was the ship owners outrightly rejecting our proposal to ensure that when a seafarer is repatriated, and if they choose to be repatriated to their home, it is their home address that they get repatriated to, and that they are covered for all their expenses, and they are maintained throughout that journey, leaving the ship to knocking on the door and being let in, by their family. So during COVID, this is another one of the COVID amendments that I would say during that, and exacerbated by some seafarers, many seafarers being forced into quarantine upon arrival home, 2 weeks or more, being left on their own to sustain and maintain themselves. Manila airport, walk out the door, boom, right, I'm on my own now. Many Filipino seafarers using that as an example again. could spend 2 days getting from Manila to their home. I mean, there's 7,000 islands in the archipelago of the Philippines. It's just a phenomenally huge country. It's not the only example. I mean, you could arrive home in Moscow and Russian Federation runs from there to Vladivostok and beyond. So it's a huge, 7 time zones. So that was a real disappointment. That really took the wind out of my sails. I'm trying to sustain a kind of, in my summing up speech, I was thinking to myself, can I seriously hail this experience this week when that issue was resolved and we saw the ship owners just resolutely just refused to engage on? I couldn't. So it was a bit of a downbeat assessment that I made of the whole process. The other amendment that this is one put forward by ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, on our own, was the coming back to the issue of the system of protection for seafarers. We wanted to make sure that the seafarers had the information prior to engagement about how the system of protection works that agents are supposed to have, and that did get agreed. So that's an improvement to the convention. That it's, again, it doesn't sound much access to information, but that's going to be really important, and in particular for the trade unions that represent seafarers to have and to be able to support the seafarers when that happens. Under the MLC, your listeners will have heard me mention a couple of times already a sort of financial security which the ship owner has to have in place, and that's generally supplied and maintained by P&I clubs. So that's the mutual arrangements where they kind of self-insure and cover the liability that each has towards the convention. We wanted to increase the current provision from 4 months. So it's 4 months of wages and other benefits under the seafarers employment contract. And we wanted to double that to 8. And that would be probably one of the first examples of when the convention has continuously improved. So it has a standard, it's a numerical value, and we want to improve it. So what we heard from the ship owners around that issue was that the current system looks a bit shaky, in terms of when you quantify in the worst case scenario what the costs of providing the existing provision for a large fleet of vessels to an operator. They quantify that and they make sure that they have a sufficient underwriting within the system to cover that off. And when they think about doubling that, the answer was no, we can't do it. And we are worried about the existing system, the sustainability of the system. So what we agreed, I think we were quite pragmatic about that. We said, look, if the existing system is shaky and we cannot come here and argue for an improvement in the system, then we've got a problem. It's a problem that the governments need to be thinking about, because it'll all fall on them if the system collapses. And so there will be then, this is another resolution we adopted, which will result in a working group to discuss the financial security system, and with a bit of luck and a bit of fair wind, we can come forward with some solid proposals at the next STC to look at that.
Right. When is the next STC?
So the next STC, initially we were in a 2-yearly phase, but we're now in a 3-yearly cycle. So we'll be meeting in April 2025. Well, I say April, I mean the beginning of 2025 will be our next session. So there's 3 years work ongoing in between the 2 sessions. There was a couple of other proposals that we dealt with. If I've got time, Francesca, and I know you. The proposal led by Australia was supported by a number of other governments. They were particularly concerned about the number of suicides that were being reported again during the crew change crisis. And although there was a few concerns about the taxonomy of how that database and the recording the deaths and that, and who would be who would hold the database, that was all resolved, and we've got a broad provision for the ILO to call on member states to report, make sure they're investigated, all deaths at sea are investigated and reported centrally into the ILO. So that went forward. And then the final proposal, which again added to my sort of sense of despondency at the end of the week, if I may describe it like that, was a proposal that was actually brought forward by the EU group of countries, 27, led by France, who currently holds the presidency of the EU. And that was to reduce the maximum period on board provided on the convention of 12 months down to 11 months, which of course the committee of experts had already stated, and this became very apparent during COVID, the crew change crisis, was actually 11 months to allow for the crewed annual leave to be taken within the year. So practically it's 11 months. Unfortunately, the ship owners don't accept that, and many governments didn't. But in the end, that proposal was withdrawn because we couldn't get agreement on the exception that some government and the ship owners wanted, so that it isn't an absolute right. We wanted it codified as an absolute right to be repatriated no later than 11 months to reflect the Committee of Experts position and the generally understood norm. We weren't happy about the exception because you know that during COVID-19, during the crew change crisis, force majeure was used as an argument. And we think force majeure as a concept is generally understood and was understood during the crew change crisis. Unfortunately, you know, there was not a universal acceptance of when force majeure could no longer be used. I might say we as ILO, the Special Tripartite Committee, we have a bunch, you know, we have officers elected by each group and we meet as the officers of the STC. And we did throughout the crew change crisis. We agreed that force majeure no longer existed within sort of 3 months of it being breaking out in March 20, whenever it was. So the French proposal for the EU 23 was a bit troubling for us because it did try to codify an exemption. And you'll appreciate, I'm sure, and many of your listeners will, that once you codify an exception, the risk is it doesn't become an exception anymore. It becomes a norm. So somebody say, there's a provision here, we'll use that because there's, this has happened or that's happened. And it's a bit inconvenient for us to do the crew change. Now, we were very wary of that, but the wording that the EU group had come up with was quite strong in terms of that. So we could live with it because we thought, getting it in as 11 months and resolving that argument would be important. But in the end, we could not get agreement around the wording. And there's this incredible photograph I've got, I'll share it with you one day, which shows the track changes and all the twisting and turns. And it was like a flipping rainbow. It all had different colors to reflect all the different points coming in. And in the end, I refused to bend. So we walked away from that. So that issue will come back at STC 5, I suspect. But, by the time we get to STC 5, I'll be thinking, well, why should it be 11 months?
Yes.
Let's have 6 months, shall we? Let's have an argument about 6 months. I'll create a few jobs and improve recruitment. Anyway, I mean, there was another resolution also, which I should mention because it's really, really important issue, which is on sexual harassment, bullying and violence on board ship. Those are big, very high profile cases in the United States. So the United States, who haven't actually ratified the MLC, I think they should get their fingers out. Sorry to make that political point, but they brought forward this issue, and the resolution essentially said that this should be picked up by the ILO and the IMO, International Maritime Organization, and there should be joint activity on that, which we were absolutely 100% behind. The ship owners were behind, all the governments got behind that. And that's, again, another piece of work that will now go forward and will inform, no doubt, what the ILO and the IMO will do on this issue for maritime going forward. So really important. And probably after all of that, after the month or so that's passed, perhaps I was rather harsh on the whole process in my summing up. But I think one of the questions you wanted to ask me, if I could kind of jump in and just carry on, is what's missing. And I think, as the seafarers group and as the spokesperson, we work continuously on the MLC. And we had a short, medium and long-term strategy developed over the past 2 to 3 years. What we brought forward at STC 4 was our immediate priorities, thinking about COVID and the crew change crisis. We have a broader and longer term plan for how we can improve the convention, because the convention, when it was adopted in 2006, it was essentially a consolidation exercise, right? And so there was a lot of, we all have to behave ourselves because there's lots of things we could have improved on that, and lots of things that are not in it that we wanted in it. There's nothing about pensions and saving for retirement is for one thing. Criminalization of seafarers is also something that is not in the convention, and that's something that they face on an ongoing basis. So, the understanding was, look, let's stick to the goal of consolidating essentially the 39 maritime instruments and all the resolutions that went, all the recommendations that went with those conventions. And then we will work together in good faith, reach consensus about how we can continuously improve the convention so those minimum standards become the MLC becomes a passport to decent work for seafarers. And what I detected, particularly during STC for both part 1 and part 2, in the immediate aftermath of the crew change crisis, is that the ship owners have lost their way. And I think this is what's really important about due diligence in the supply chain, and other stakeholders, other businesses, the Global Compact and others saying, hey, hang on a minute, what happened to this journey towards decent work? Why are we talking minimum standards? Because these are pretty basic asks, this convention. It's not, it's, say not groundbreaking. I mean, silly to say that because it was hugely groundbreaking back in 2016. Yeah. The first time, we call it the Seafarers Bill of Rights, but it is just a collection of minimum standards. So how do we move that on? How do we improve the lot? COVID showed us that seafarers are key workers. What does that mean, though? What does it mean? Is it just 2 words? Just, great key workers, so what? Like amongst all the other key workers who kept things moving during COVID. But the problem is, the reason we're in this global economic chaos right now, with raging inflation in many countries, certainly in my own, I'm sitting here looking at RPI at 11%, is because they basically shuttered up the global supply chain. There's a direct link to what happened during COVID and the mess we're in now. What frustrates me is I'm not sure we're going to learn these lessons and fix things, make sure we don't do it again. So when you say seafarers are key workers, that's got to mean something. Let's move them on from minimum standards. Let's say they deserve better than what they've got. They deserve to be recognized. They deserve to be, yes, acknowledged. And we need to fulfill our commitment to continuously improve the minimum conditions in which they're employed under globally. Problem with minimums, they become maximums and they erode higher levels, collective bargaining agreements. So, what I want to see from the due diligence in the supply chain with people is first take responsibility for that and question, who am I doing business with and what is their commitment to human rights in the supply chain? Now, there's a contemporary example I could give you. Right now, you might have heard of P&O Ferry sacking 800 seafarers in the UK, right, over a Zoom call. And the government has brought forward 9 measures, right? I don't know why they didn't make it 10, frankly, Francesca, but anyway, 9 measures they brought forward. And one of them was, we're going to make sure that the minimum wage is paid in the ferry sector in UK ports. And the easiest way they could do that, they said, was to amend the Harbours Bill and ask the port operators to check if the ships in their ports are complying with the law. And you'd think to yourself, any ordinary person on the street would say, well, you wouldn't do business with someone who's breaking the law, would you? Wouldn't that be okay? But the ports industry here is going nuts about this. Absolutely apoplectic they are about the fact that suddenly they have a responsibility to check that the ships sitting in their ports are complying with the law. And I just can't get my head around that. I'm thinking, hang on a minute, where have you been this last 2.5 years? This is just a fundamental requirement. Businesses need to take responsibility for those they have relationships with commercially. The investors are doing it. The investors are asking everybody, right, what's your ESG? And the S in the E and the S and the G is the seafarers. It's the social aspects. Come on, and that's what's missing for me.
The code of conduct that we created with the Sustainable Shipping Initiative, there sits behind it a self-assessment questionnaire where ship owners themselves can look at. And so, what you describe as minimum becoming the maximum, so they can move away from that and see how they can improve on each of the 53, I think it is, points in the code of conduct, that they can look and see what's basic, what's intermediate, what's excellent, and they can see themselves. And each element has 3 or 4 different examples of how you can be providing social activities or the kind of levels of shore leave, or ensuring that enough shore leave happens, or whatever part of the code of conduct it is, so that ship owners can see how they can improve and they can see the next step up in that kind of constant improvement that you talk about. And I guess that kind of brings me on to the last question. I mean, you know, our code of conduct is voluntary at the moment. It relies on ship owners and operators to be transparent, to be honest, and to be on this journey of improvement. And I guess, so my last question to you would be just about what else is needed to increase sort of transparency and accountability in the shipping industry. And I guess that would include, it's a very arcane employment model, you know, ship owners, seafarers, as of course, you know, Mark, might be from one country, employed by a crewing agency for a ship owner based in Switzerland for a ship that's flagged for convenience in another country, and they might be on international waters for large majority of their time. So finding out who's responsible, should they be seeking remedy, for example, for an issue is very difficult. And obviously that's where unions are so important, and collective bargaining agreements are ensured aboard ships that are flagged under countries of convenience. But I wonder, just finally, where you see the next big opportunity or push or need for accountability will come from in the shipping industry.
Well, that is it's a big question, and
yeah.
What STC 4 was in two parts. I think I mentioned that earlier. In part one, we adopted an important resolution which kind of reflected on the experience during the COVID-19 pandemic and the crew change crisis. And it's a lot of stuff in there, and it recalls a lot of very good work. The ILO governing body resolution, the UN General Assembly, everybody, WHO, everybody had said lots of very well-meaning things about shipping and seafarers and their importance. But there was one sentence in there that said, summarize it, it said that the STC called upon the ILO governing body, the ILO Secretary General, to invite the governing body to write to the UN Secretary General, calling on him to convene an ad hoc interagency task force to understand, these are my words now, what happened and what went wrong. Why did we get in this mess? And my hope for that is no real, I'm not naive, but my hope was that the fact that the industry is so invisible, there is lack of transparency, the fact that there is precarious employment, the fact that the ship owners come from one group of countries, register their ships in another bunch that usually the OECD gets very excited about because they're also tax havens, and they have no enforcement. They can't enforce flags of convenience, absolutely. And the crew come from another set of countries, and then we wonder why we get in these messes, because actually no one gives a monkeys. Frankly, bluntly, no one cares. So that the American ship owners who found themselves in difficulties, who went to the US government and said, help us. And they got told, well, why are you in Panama? You don't employ Americans. You're not based here. Yeah. You don't pay tax here. What do you want from me? Sling your hook. I think the UK government gave British ship owners a slightly better hearing in terms of, supporting their companies. But this is essentially the problem. We've got deregulation writ large. We've got no accountability, and the ship owners are even starting to realize this. I mean, there was a guy who I think he's the boss of Euronav, kind of fessed up and said to this international conference very early on in the crew change crisis, guys, we brought it upon ourselves. We've hidden away in tax havens. We've not wanted to be regulated. We don't want to be taxed. And now when we need help, who do we turn to? What's the point of a Panamanian ship, a ship owner who bases these ships in Panama, turn into the Panamanian government and say, sort out the crew change crisis? Because they can't do anything. No one listens to them. They're not important. They don't have a navy. They don't have embassies in every port. There's just nothing they can do. It's just, you'd think, holy cow, you wouldn't create a system like this if you'd thought about it. So how do we put all that back together? Well, we've got to shine a light on it. We've got to be open. We've got to have that conversation. We need to put these pieces back together. So we've got this transparent, accountable. I think ESG is the answer. I think investors, I think those who like Unilever or whoever in the Global Compact to say, guys, we're the facilitators of this, because we put our cargoes on these ships. We've got to ask this question: is this good for the world? Is this good for the environment? Is this good? What I care about is this good for the seafarers?
I think also there are banks that, you know, there is a kind of group of leading banks who are looking very closely at the ships that they are investing in.
They won't finance them. You're absolutely right. Yeah. So yeah. I think that's I'm a very optimistic person. Hopefully I haven't persuaded you otherwise during this interview, but I'm very, very hopeful that what you've just highlighted, the banks, the big multinationals are starting to have, it's clear they're asking these questions. We cannot invest in these dirty ships. We want environmentally friendly ships. We can't invest in ships who don't treat their, in ship owners who don't treat their crews appropriately. And this then becomes, you know, an active and live conversation. Ship owners start asking themselves, well, why am I hiding in the Cayman Islands? Why don't I go back to the UK? Why am I in Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands? Why don't I go back to the States? Those governments need to be prepared to have a conversation with those ship owners and say, what do you need from us to run your business? They're not going to come back if you're going to say, oh, by the way, here's 16 tons of regulation that you're now going to comply with. That's why they're out there.
And I think that from our experience, and we try to sort of sit between government, between civil society and businesses to, encourage collective action and so on. From our perspective, I think the crew change crisis shone a light on a part of their operations and their supply chain that, for example, brands, cargo owners, just had no visibility of, and therefore no real knowledge of, and there are a lot of companies going, wow, because it's not kind of part of the obvious tiered supply chain shipping, it's not the product, it's how the product gets to them. And in our experience, certainly some big global brands are going, help, gosh, it's an oversight, not a deliberate ignorance, I think. And they're looking very hard to even just get visibility in the first instance of who is carrying their cargo and whether those ships have collective bargaining agreements and so on.
That's right. I think, and that's been my experience as well. It's just that we are literally invisible,
Yeah.
And that, hopefully, that if there's a silver lining, if one could say that about an experience as shocking as COVID-19 has been for the world, and the crew change crisis, as bad as that was for seafarers, if there's anything good comes of this, it's we're now out in the open and people can see. Problem is, we can very, very quickly slip back into old ways, and the ship owners and the industry just sort of prefers to be invisible, prefers to sort of operate under the radar. They don't want all the attention. And my job in my small way, as much as I possibly can, is to make sure that doesn't happen, make a lot of noise.
Yeah, and I think from IHRB's perspective, working with the industry and civil society together, with governments to just keep the issue front and center and keep pushing for improvement in the seafarer lot. So thank you very much for talking to me, Mark. That's been so interesting. We'll continue our work together. Good luck with STC5, and I imagine the build up for that has already started.
Yeah. And can I thank you as well for being interested in what the industry does, and for all the work you've done to help us, particularly over the last couple of years. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thanks very much, Mark.